Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're doing something that I think is going to feel a little bit counterintuitive for a lot of us.
Yeah.
Because we live in a world that is just obsessed with the new.
Oh, absolutely. The cutting edge.
Right. We have, AI rendering, real-time 3D engines. We've got tools that can simulate complex fluid dynamics in a nanosecond. But today, to understand how any of that actually works, to really grasp the soul of movement, we have to turn off the computer. We have to open a book.
And not just any book either. I mean, we are opening the Bible.
The absolute Bible of the industry.
Yeah.
We are talking about Richard Williams, the Animator Survival Kit. If you talk to anyone in animation, whether they are working at Pixar on the latest massive 3D blockbuster, or they're hand drawing an indie short in their bedroom, this book is likely sitting right there on their desk.
It is the foundational text. And Richard Williams, he wasn't just an incredible animator. He was really a scholar of the art form. I mean, he directed Who Framed Roger Rabbit. He won Oscars. But his real legacy, his lasting impact, is this specific collection of knowledge.
And we aren't trying to tackle the entire book today. Because, frankly, that would take us a 10-hour series. We are zooming in, we're laser focusing on Chapter 6. And it has this incredibly provocative title that I think stops a lot of people in their tracks. It's called Advancing Backwards to 1940.
Which really sounds like a contradiction in terms, doesn't it? Advancing backwards, it sounds like a full retreat.
It really does. My first thought when I read that was, why on earth would we want to go backwards? We have objectively better technology now. We have infinite resolutions. Why are we talking about 1940? But the source material makes this really compelling argument that to actually move forward, you have to look back.
You do. And I think it's important to state right up front that this is not about nostalgia. It's not about saying, oh, things were just better in the old days because everyone wore fedoras and listened to swing music. It is entirely about structure. The thesis of this chapter, and really I'd say the mission statement of the entire Williams philosophy, is that the golden age of animation, specifically around 1940 at the Disney Studios, they perfected a system of mechanics that has simply never been surpassed.
And we're talking about the era of Pinocchio, Fantasia, Bambi.
The absolute heavy hitters, the masterpieces. And the argument here is that before you can break the rules, or before you can just let a computer handle the rules for you, you have to understand exactly why those rules exist in the first place. There is this great analogy in the text where Williams talks about construction.
Oh, the house building thing, yes.
Right. He says everyone, and this is especially true for students or people totally new to the medium, they want to decorate the house immediately.
They want to hang the curtains right away.
Exactly. They want to bring in the interesting furniture, pick up the wallpaper, set up the moody lighting. They want to do all the cool stuff, the acting, the funny facial expressions. But Williams is basically grabbing them by the shoulders and saying, you haven't built the walls yet. You cannot skip the cornerstones and the structural supports. If you do, the whole house falls down.
I love that analogy so much. It is so incredibly visual. You can't build a luxury penthouse if you haven't poured a concrete foundation. And he brings in a quote from Art Babbitt to really back this up. Now, for the listeners who might not be deep into animation history, who exactly is Art Babbitt?
Art Babbitt is royalty. He was one of the absolute top-tier animators at Disney in the 1930s and 40s. He developed the character of Goofy. And he was also, interestingly enough, a key leader in the famous Disney animator strike of 1941. So he was a man of intense principle, but also an absolute master of how things move.
And Babbitt talks about how back in those early Disney days, like the very early 1930s, nobody taught them any of this stuff. There was no Animation 101 class you could just go take at your local university.
No, absolutely not, because the medium itself was being invented in real time. Babbitt says they were literally stumbling in the dark. They had to discover the raw mechanics of motion entirely by themselves. They had to look at their film and figure out, why does this character look totally weightless? Or why does this guy's walk look like he has a broken leg? And by the time they hit 1940, they had finally solved it.
They cracked the code.
They codified a system that was, in Williams's own words, precise and simple.
So our mission today is to completely unpack that system. We're going to look at the quote-unquote boring stuff that actually makes the magic happen. The charts, the numbering, the spacing, the hierarchy of drawings. And we are going to start with a story that I think perfectly illustrates where all this control actually comes from. And it involves a man named Grim Natwick.
A total legend. Grim Natwick. He is essentially the bridge between the silent film era and the golden age.
William shares this amazing anecdote about working with Natwick when Natwick was quite elderly. I mean, the man was well past standard retirement age, but he was still showing up and drawing. And this is the guy who created Betty Boop. He animated heavily on Snow White. He had literally seen the entire history of the medium unfold in front of his eyes.
And what's really fascinating about that story is how that history lived inside of him. It wasn't just memories in his head, it was hardwired into his hands. Williams describes coming into the studio and just watching Natwick draw. Because he was so old, his muscle memory would just sort of snap between different distinct eras of his long life, depending on the day.
That is just wild to imagine.
Isn't it? One day he'd sit down and start drawing that classic 1920s rubber hose style. You know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Limbs flailing everywhere, no actual joints, very loose and bouncy, like the earliest Mickey Mouse or Felix the Cat shorts.
The era of spaghetti arms.
Exactly, spaghetti arms, no bones. Then the very next day, his brain would just click over into the 1930s Snow White phase. Very smooth, highly realistic, heavily structured movement. And then the next day after that, he's suddenly doing the sharp, angular, limited animation style of the 1950s UPA era, like Mr. Magoo.
It is almost like he was a living, breathing time machine.
He really was. But there was this one specific day where Williams catches him drawing in a very particular mechanical way. And he notices something unusual on the paper. Natwick wasn't just drawing the character. He wasn't just sketching the arc of the action. He was making these tiny, precise little tick marks on the very edge of the drawing paper.
And this right here is the aha moment, isn't it? This is the archaeology of animation unfolding.
This is the exact origin story of the chart. Williams realized that Natwick wasn't just feeling the motion intuitively, he was mathematically calculating it. He was explicitly indicating the specific spatial increments between the drawings.
Okay, let's unpack this chart concept for everyone listening.
Right.
Because I know it sounds a bit technical at first, but it is actually really intuitive once you visualize it. A chart is basically a visual guide for the assistant animator, right?
Correct. In the traditional animation pipeline, you have the main animator who draws the key moments. And we'll definitely get into that hierarchy in a bit, but then an assistant has to fill in all the gaps. The chart is a simple vertical line drawn directly on the side of the paper that tells that assistant exactly where those in-between drawings should go in terms of both time and physical space.
It's essentially dictating the timing and the texture of the movement. It changes how the action feels to the audience.
It dictates the actual physics of the movement. Look, if you put the tick marks completely evenly spaced on that line, just tick, 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 right down the middle, the action is going to be constant. It's mechanical.
Like a robot. Or a conveyor belt moving at one steady speed.
Right. But organic things in real life rarely ever move at a constant robotic speed. Cars accelerate from a stop, then they decelerate at a red light. Your arm swings incredibly fast at the bottom of the arc, and then naturally slows down as it reaches the top against gravity.
So Natwick was literally marking out, slowing in and slowing out. In modern computer animation terms, we would call this ease in and ease out.
Yes. Cushioning is another term they used back then, which I actually really prefer. It sounds so much softer. It implies physical weight. You are cushioning the stop of an object.
The text gives this perfectly clear example to help visualize this. I want you all to imagine a closed hand, a tight fist opening up to become a pointing finger.
Okay, let's visualize that. You have drawing A, the fist, and you have drawing B, the pointing finger. Those are your two main drawings, the start and the end. But the real question is, how do you get from A to B?
That is the million-dollar question.
If you draw a chart next to it that clusters a bunch of tick marks right near the beginning next to the fist and another cluster right near the end next to the pointing finger, but you leave a massive empty gap right in the middle, you get a snap.
And just pops up and pop.
Wham! Because it's covering a huge amount of distance in a fraction of a second in the middle. But if you change that chart and you add more tick marks evenly spaced throughout the entire line, that exact same hand opens slowly. Maybe it looks lethargic or gentle. The drawings themselves, A and B, are totally identical. The start and finish haven't changed a bit, but the chart completely dictates the performance.
That is such a cool, vital distinction. The drawing itself provides the look of the character, but the chart provides the acting.
Precisely. And Williams actually asked Grim Natwick about this. He said, Grim, did these charts just gradually move across the page away from the characters over the years? And Natwick just gave him this faraway, nostalgic look and said, yes. It all started as little marks right on the character's physical path. Literally drawing ticks on the tip of the character's nose or on their knuckles as they move. And then eventually, to clean things up, it evolved into this abstract tool living safely on the edge of the paper.
So that leads us directly into the hierarchy of how a scene is actually constructed. You mentioned assistants earlier, and I absolutely love the history nugget in this chapter about where the term in-betweener actually came from.
It is a classic case of necessity being the mother of invention. Back in the very early 1920s, the animators did absolutely everything themselves. You sat at your desk and you drew every single sequential frame yourself, start to finish.
Which just sounds physically exhausting.
It was completely impossible to scale as a business. You could never make a feature-length film working that way. So you have this guy, Dick Humer. He's a top New York animator working for the Fleischer Studios, the studio that was famous for Mutt and Jeff. And later they did the amazing Superman theatrical shorts. Anyway, Dick is completely drowning in his workload. He goes to the bosses and says, look, your work is great, the assignments are great, but I physically cannot get enough of it done in a week. So Dick says, give me someone to just put in the tedious drawings in between my main drawings, and I promise you I will do 3 times as much work.
And thus, the mighty in-betweener was born. Although, didn't they initially just call them helpers?
They did. Dick Humer claims that he personally invented the specific term in-betweener, though he admits in the text that it might have actually been the Fleischer's idea and he just kind of went along with it over time. But regardless of who actually coined the phrase, that moment changed the entire workflow of the industry forever. It officially created a strict hierarchy of drawings. You now had extremes, in-betweens, and the breakdown.
Let's define these terms clearly, because this is the core vocabulary of the 1940s system. First up, extremes.
The extremes are the absolute start and end points of any given action. They are the exact moments where change in direction happens. So if a pendulum is swinging from left to right, the furthest left point it reaches before swinging back is an extreme. The furthest right point is an extreme. The object literally stops in space for a microsecond and reverses its trajectory.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. And the
Nice.
in-betweens are just the filler.
Right. They just fill the dead space, they define the smooth path connecting the points. But the real secret sauce, and this is where every single beginner completely messes up, and where the advanced part of advancing backwards really comes into play, is the breakdown, which is also known as the passive position.
The text spends a significant amount of time harping on this. Why is the middle drawing the breakdown so incredibly dangerous to get wrong?
Because of the arc. Let's go right back to that pendulum example.
Yeah.
You have the pendulum swinging all the way to the left, that's extreme 1, and all the way to the right, that's extreme 2. If you just hand those 2 drawings to a junior assistant or even to a computer algorithm and say, hey, draw the middle, and they aren't actively thinking about real-world physics, they are just going to draw the pendulum bob exactly halfway between the 2 points, perfectly on a straight horizontal line.
Which, if you think about it purely geometrically, sounds totally logical. Just connect dot A to dot B.
It sounds incredibly logical, but it completely breaks the reality of the scene. Because a pendulum is attached to a rigid string anchored at the top, it has to swing in an arc. It has to dip down lower in the middle of the swing. If you draw that middle position on a perfectly straight horizontal line between the 2 extremes, the arm of the pendulum effectively shrinks. It mathematically gets shorter in the middle and then miraculously grows long again at the ends.
It would look like it's pulsing or mutating on a screen.
Exactly, it wobbles. The source text gives this hilarious, but honestly slightly terrifying, real-world example of the Kia or girl.
This specific story had me laughing out loud. This was from an old commercial that Williams worked on, right?
Yes, a juice commercial. They had this cute little character, a little girl named Aurora. And she has these massive, perfectly circular eyes, very appealing, very classic Disney-esque design. So Williams himself draws the extremes beautifully. Eyes open, looking far left, eyes open, looking far right. He hands it off to an inexperienced assistant to finish. The assistant just lazily measures the exact distance between the pupils linearly.
So instead of the eyes rotating spherically in the socket or naturally blinking as they cross the center, what actually happened?
The circular eyes became literally egg-shaped in the middle breakdown drawings because the assistant just drew a straight line between the circles without accounting for the curvature of the eyeball. The overall volume of the eye squashed down flat. So when they finally played it back on screen, instead of a cute girl looking around, her eyes were violently wobbling and pulsating like eggs being crushed.
Wobble, wobble, wobble.
That is the text's exact refrain. Wobble, wobble, wobble. There's another brilliant example he gives of a live-action actor holding a coffee cup. They were doing rotoscoping, which is tracing directly over live-action film footage frame by frame. An inexperienced in-betweener got the scene, but they didn't really understand 3D perspective. So as the coffee cup moved smoothly across the screen in an arc, they just flattened out the curve of the cup's rim in all the in-betweens.
And the result of flattening that curve?
Williams describes it as the cup doing a full-blown St. Vitus's dance. It looked like the cup was literally frying on a griddle. Total disaster.
The major lesson here really seems to be entirely about volume.
It is. The golden rule that Williams hammers home relentlessly in this chapter is this: volume control is vastly more important than line quality.
That's fascinating. So the neatness of the sketch doesn't even matter that much.
Not compared to the volume. You can have a scratchy, messy, hairy, just plain ugly pencil line. But if the volume, the actual 3D mass of the object, stays perfectly consistent, the human brain readily accepts it as a real solid object. But if the line is beautiful, clean, totally pristine, but the volume subtly shrinks or grows even a few millimeters, the illusion of life is completely broken. The animation fails.
So to properly control that volume, you absolutely need that breakdown drawing to be precise. You, as the lead animator, have to physically draw that middle position yourself to define the proper arc. You cannot leave that critical step to the computer or to the junior assistant.
Correct. You have to define the path through space. You are anchoring the physical reality of the scene.
Moving a bit further up the hierarchy, we have extremes, we have breakdowns, we have in-betweens, but then there's something that sits even higher than the extreme, the absolute peak of development, the key.
The key. Now, getting into this touches on what Williams affectionately refers to as the great circle disease.
Animators just loving to circle big numbers on their drawing pages. I've seen this in documentaries looking at old pencil tests.
They really do. It's a deeply ingrained habit. You finish a tough drawing, you write page number 12 in the corner, and you proudly circle it. But Williams firmly argues that we shouldn't just be circling every single extreme we draw. We should heavily reserve those circles strictly for the keys.
What exactly is the distinction between a key and an extreme? Because honestly, I feel like before reading this, I would use those two words completely interchangeably.
A lot of working professionals still do use them interchangeably, but in this specific 1940 system we're studying, the difference is absolutely vital to understand. The key is defined as the storytelling drawing. It is the single drawing that shows exactly what is happening in the narrative of the shot.
The text suggests a very practical test for figuring this out, the wall test.
Yes, the wall test. It's brilliant in its simplicity. If you take just the drawings you've circled, just your keys, and you physically pin them up on a corkboard on the wall, a total stranger should be able to walk into the room, look at them, and completely understand the entire narrative flow of the scene. If they can't tell exactly what's happening, you either pick the wrong keys or you miss drawing one entirely.
So let's use the great example straight from the book. We have a scene of a man casually walking up to a blackboard, picking up a piece of chalk and writing his name. What are the keys in that specific scenario?
The keys are incredibly simple. Drawing 1, the man standing there, that's your start. Drawing 2, the man holding the chalk against the board, that's the action. And drawing 3, the man writing, that's the result. That is the whole story. Man goes to board to write.
What about all the complex steps he takes to get over there? The mechanics of the walk cycle itself?
Those are just extremes. The specific contact position of his heel hitting the floor, that is definitely an extreme. It is physically necessary for the mechanics of a walking motion. Obviously, you can't animate a walk without heel contacts, but it is not the story. The narrative isn't man steps down with his left foot. The narrative is man approaches board.
I see. So mentally separating these concepts really helps you organize your entire thought process. It fundamentally prioritizes the emotional, narrative beats over the raw mechanical beats.
It perfectly prevents what Williams calls tangling up. If you mentally treat every single footstep as being just as important as the main narrative beat, you will get hopelessly lost in the weeds of the timeline. Williams tells this beautiful story about visiting Frank Thomas, who was one of the legendary Disney 9 old men.
Absolute masters of the craft.
Frank was at his desk, and he was spending an entire full working day on one single solitary drawing of a cat.
Just one drawing. In an industry where you're expected to produce multiple feet of finished film every single week.
Literally just one drawing all day. Williams was totally shocked by this pace. But Frank looked at him and said, "Damn it, I've been working all day on this trying to get this exact expression right." And that's when it clicked for Williams. He realized, oh, it's the key. That one specific drawing of the cat was the emotional anchor for the entire sequence. If that one drawing failed to communicate the feeling, the rest of the scene was completely worthless anyway.
It's exactly like an acting beat in live action. If the lead actor misses the emotion of the crucial line, the lighting and the camera movement don't matter at all. The scene fails.
Exactly. The in-betweens and the extremes are just the vehicle to get you to the emotion. The key is the moment.
So once you fully grasp these different levels, keys, extremes, breakdowns,
Yeah.
you eventually have to sit down and decide how you're actually going to execute drawing the scene. And the text clearly outlines 3 distinct methods of animating. And honestly, reading through it, it really feels like a Goldilocks and the Three Bears scenario.
It absolutely is. The 3 ways to animate. Method number 1 is known as straight ahead.
This is sort of the natural, intuitive way, right? Like a bored kid drawing a stickman flip book in the corner of a school notebook.
It is exactly that. You draw frame 1, then you draw frame 2, then frame 3, and you just keep going sequentially. You just plow forward. You honestly don't know exactly where you're going to end up on the page. You are just organically reacting to the drawing you just did.
Wooly Reitherman, another one of the huge Disney legends, absolutely loved working this way. He said it was where the real magic happened, because your unconscious mind takes over the pencil.
And the pros of straight ahead are exactly that magic. It's incredibly fluid, it has explosive spontaneity, it can organically produce happy accidents and surprises that you could literally never plan out on a chart. You get these wild, zany, unpredictable movements. But the cons?
The cons sound remarkably expensive.
Very, very expensive. The text explicitly lists them out. Things naturally wander off path. Characters organically grow and shrink as you draw them over and over. You might start out drawing a cute little mouse, and by the time you hit frame 200, he's inadvertently the size of a large cat because you lost track of the volume.
That's a nightmare.
It gets worse. The director hates us because he can't see what's actually happening in the scene until it's completely finished. And worst of all, the producer hates us because when it inevitably wanders off model, it is insanely expensive to go back and fix.
Because if you get to frame 100 and realize your character's proportions are totally ruined, you have to literally throw the whole stack of paper in the trash and start from frame 1.
There is no Command-Z undo button for a graphite pencil on paper.
So that perfectly leads us to method 2. Pose to pose.
This is the highly structured, disciplined approach. You carefully plan your keys first, then you plan out your extremes, then you carefully chart your breakdowns. You know mathematically exactly where the character's hand will be on frame 47 before you even draw it. You map out the entire skeleton of the scene before you fill in a single detail.
And I'm guessing the producer absolutely loves this one.
The producer adores it because it's incredibly budget-friendly. It's totally calculated and predictable. But the major downside artistically is that it can end up feeling very robotic. It can completely lack that organic spark of life. Williams calls it cold-blooded. If you stick too rigidly to your perfect little plan, the character just looks like a stiff puppet hitting marks on a stage.
So inevitably, seeking the perfect balance, we arrive at method 3, the undisputed winner.
The combination method. This is exactly what the Golden Age animators mastered by 1940, and what Chapter 6 vehemently advocates for everyone to use. You start by using pose to establish the rigid structure, the size control, the clear storytelling, the exact timing. You ensure the producer is happy and that the foundational walls won't fall down. But then
you sprinkle in the magic.
Right. You use straight-ahead techniques nestled neatly right in between those structured guides. And specifically, you utilize a technique that Williams calls layering the run.
This was a genuinely fascinating visualization for me. He talks about doing completely separate animation runs over the same sequence, but for different specific parts of the body.
Yes. So, let's take it back to our guy walking up to the chalkboard. You might first animate the main core body movement, the heavy hips, the legs, the thick torso, entirely using your rigid, structured poses. You get the center of gravity and the weight perfect. Make absolute sure he doesn't shrink or grow. But then you take that finished core, you go all the way back to the beginning of the scene, and you do a completely new, straight-ahead pass just for his arms swinging loosely at his side.
So you're not even looking at or worrying about the feet anymore. You are entirely focused on the physics of the arm.
Just the arm. You let it swing totally freely, letting it drag and overlap, just organically reacting to the movement of the core body you already built. Then you go back again, and maybe you do a third separate pass entirely for his floppy hair or the long tails of his heavy coat. This layered way, you get the absolute rock-solid solidity of the pose-to-pose structure, but you also capture the beautifully fluid, organic feel of straight-ahead animation on all the flexible secondary parts.
It's literally building the sturdy house first and then decorating it with the flowing curtains.
Exactly. You absolutely cannot hang the curtains, the hair, and the clothes until the load-bearing walls of the body are fully up. But if you try to build the walls and hang the curtains at the exact same time on the same piece of paper, you will just make a confusing mess. Separation of elements is key.
Now, in the text itself, there is a very meticulous step-by-step walkthrough of this exact workflow using that man at the chalkboard example. And I want to really step through it carefully because it just perfectly solidifies the entire process we've been talking about.
Let's do it. This is the ultimate recipe for a successful scene.
So, step 1, we define the keys.
Right. We aggressively draw the man starting at rest, the man reaching out and picking up the chalk, and the man finally writing on the board. We boldly circle those specific drawing numbers, we stick them up on the wall, we step back and ask, does it clearly tell the story? Yes, it does. We now have our unbreakable narrative backbone.
Moving to step 2, we define the extremes.
Now we need the physical mechanics to connect the story. We need to figure out exactly how he gets his mass from point A to point B physically. We need to draw the precise contact positions where his heels hit the hard floor as he strides. We need to find the absolute lowest physical point of his bodily bend as he squats to reach for the chalk. That's the anticipation. These drawings rigidly define the outer physical limits of the action in space.
Step 3, breakdowns.
Now we must show the arc of the movement. As he stands back up from picking up that piece of chalk, his heavy head doesn't just travel diagonally in a perfectly straight geometric line. Maybe the head naturally dips down first, or maybe it swings back slightly to balance his weight. We have to draw that specific middle position to guarantee his skull doesn't wobble or shrink.
Yeah.
We are completely locking in the volume there.
And finally, step 4, layering.
We've got the solid skeleton fully working. Now we go all the way back to the start and animate the loose coattail flapping wildly behind him using that spontaneous straight-ahead action. We animate the bounce of his hair. We add all the secondary texture. This is exactly where the actual charm and personality of the character finally comes out.
And there's a really heated historical debate mentioned here about exactly when you should check your work during this process. The great testing debate.
Oh, this is a massive clash of the absolute titans. On one side of the ring, you have Milt Kahl. He was a genius, widely considered the Michelangelo of Disney animation draftsmanship. He famously, arrogantly said, I know what it looks like. He wouldn't even bother looking at his own pencil tests, the rough animations filmed on a camera just to check the movement, because he was so supremely confident in his own brain's ability to calculate it.
That is just a massive, unbelievable flex. I don't need to see it moving on a screen, I just know.
Huge flex. But then on the exact opposite side, you have Ken Harris, an absolute master craftsman in his own right, the genius behind the flawless timing of Wile E. Coyote and Bugs Bunny over at Warner Bros. But Ken was remarkably humble. He said, look, I have drawn hundreds of walks in my life, but I still want to shoot a test and see it on screen.
He needed to visually confirm the actual feeling of the timing.
And Richard Williams very clearly sides with Ken Harris here, especially in our modern context. He forcefully points out that video testing or computer playback testing today isn't just a crutch for fixing sloppy mistakes. It's actually a vital tool for saving the animation from just being competent but routine. It helps you spot hidden opportunities to tweak and improve the comedic or dramatic timing.
There's also a genuinely fascinating biological note about age thrown in here, too.
Yes. Williams keenly observed over the decades that as master animators physically get older, their internal perception of time actually begins to slow down.
Really? Like, that's an actual biological phenomenon?
Yeah, apparently so. So they unconsciously tend to animate things slower and slower as they age. They start drawing far more frames than are actually necessary because their brain is just feeling the passage of time differently than a young person. The video test physically acts as a harsh corrective tool. It's an objective reality check against their internal metronome. He literally calls the video playback a, quote, useful corrective to us old bastards.
That is hilarious. And what about for the young guys just coming up?
Oh, the young guys are the exact opposite. They wildly zip stuff around way too fast, they have way too much nervous energy, and they don't hold their poses long enough. So the pencil test helps literally everyone, regardless of age, perfectly calibrate their brains back to the unforgiving standard of 24 frames per second.
Okay, so we've heavily covered the philosophy and the drawing process. Now we absolutely have to talk about the paperwork. The dreaded X sheet, which is also commonly known as the dope sheet.
The animator's absolute best friend, and simultaneously their worst nightmare.
Because to the completely uninitiated, if you look at one of these things, It just looks like a horribly complex tax form. It's this massive grid with a million tiny little boxes and columns.
It really does. It looks intensely bureaucratic and creatively stifling. But the reality is, it's actually a beautiful, precise musical score for motion. It physically represents time. Every single horizontal line down that page represents exactly one single frame of film.
And we are dealing with very specific old school film measurements here. The text explicitly talks about thinking in feet versus thinking in seconds.
This is definitely old school, but it's critically important to understand how the rhythm was originally calculated in their heads. 24 frames of film equals exactly 1 second of screen time. That's the global standard. But in physical 35mm film stock, 16 individual frames perfectly equals exactly 1 physical foot of film strip.
So these animators would literally conceptualize time in terms of physical length. They would say this dramatic pause needs to be exactly 3 feet long.
Yes. Ken Harris actually thought entirely in feet. He would sit at his desk and physically tap the eraser end of his pencil on the wood every single foot of film, just to internalize the rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. He was literally physically feeling the mechanical beat of the theater projector. Now, Williams freely admits in the book that he personally thinks in seconds, which is frankly a lot easier for most of us modern folks to grasp. But that deep, tactile connection to the physical medium is just fascinating.
And this dense sheet is where you meticulously plan everything out, specifically in what's called the action column.
That is easily the most important column on the entire page. That is where you do what Williams calls pre-animating. Before your pencil ever touches a piece of drawing paper to sketch a character, you write down the exact mathematical timing in that column. You write he takes a massive step right here. That takes exactly 12 frames. He freezes in shock right here. That holds for 8 frames. You are composing the entire underlying tempo of the scene entirely on line paper. Because if the rhythm is inherently wrong on the X-shoot, no amount of beautiful drawing will ever save it.
The text also heavily emphasizes the KISS principle here. Keep it simple, stupid. And apparently, the British animation studios had a bit of a cultural problem with this concept.
The English problem, as he calls it. Williams lived and worked in London for many years, and he tells this incredibly funny story about how the English animators just fundamentally loved bureaucratic complexity. They genuinely thought that if a numbering system was highly complicated, it must inherently be a superior, more intelligent system. So they would meticulously number their individual drawings with these completely insane alphanumeric codes like Y2B1.
Y2B1, what on earth does that even tell you about the drawing?
Exactly, nothing at all. It's like deciding to completely renumber the pages of the Encyclopedia Britannica just to walk a cartoon dog across a living room. It tells you absolutely zero about the actual timing of the shot. So Ken Harris eventually came over from America to direct, and he just started crossing that nonsense out and numbering his drawings 1, 2, 3, 4. The British team was completely, utterly shocked. They were like, "You mean we can just use normal numbers?"
Simple is always better. But within the realm of numbers, there is actually a fierce debate on which specific numbering system is best. Ken Harris obviously used sequential numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just continuously counting the physical pieces of paper. But Milk Call had a totally different system, which Williams firmly argues is actually the ultimate winner.
The camera dial system, and honestly this is just pure genius and its practical logic. Milk Call numbered his actual drawings based on the specific frame number they appeared on the camera dial.
Let me make sure I have this straight. So if a piece of paper sits on film frame number 1, he labels that drawing as number 1. But if the next piece of paper doesn't appear until film frame number 3, he labels that drawing as number 3.
Right, because you're holding the drawing for 2 frames, so he worked entirely on odd numbers, drawing 1, drawing 3, drawing 5, drawing 7. This basically implies he is naturally animating on 2s, which means holding each distinct drawing on screen for 2 consecutive frames of film.
But wait, what happens if you watch the test and realize you need to hastily add a drawing right in the middle later? Say the character's movement from frame 1 to frame 3 is just a bit too snappy and jumpy.
That is the exact mathematical beauty of it. If the move from frame 1 to frame 3 is too jumpy and you desperately need to smooth it out with a breakdown, the even number frame 2 is still completely magically available. It's just sitting there empty. You simply draw a new breakdown on a piece of paper, boldly write drawing number 2 on it, and you smoothly slot it right in the middle without having to renumber anything else.
And that clearly communicates perfectly down the pipeline to the camera department.
It is entirely foolproof. The poor cameraman looks at the stack, sees a paper labeled drawing number 5, and immediately knows without thinking that it gets photographed exactly on film frame number 5. 0 mental conversion charts are needed. It actively stops the cameraman from having to do complex algebra at 4:00 p.m. on a Friday. And trust me, having worked in production, you never, ever want the camera department doing math when they're totally exhausted. That is exactly how entire sequences get ruined.
Speaking of animating on ones and twos, this is another absolutely massive philosophical debate covered deeply in the chapter.
Yeah.
And we really should define this clearly for the listeners right now because it is so fundamentally tied to the overall visual look of animation.
Absolutely. So animating on ones simply means you are drawing a brand new, unique picture for every single frame of film. Since film is 24 frames a second, that's 24 completely unique drawings for every second of screen time. Animating on twos means you draw a picture, but the camera shoots it twice. You hold that one drawing on screen for 2 consecutive frames. So you are only physically doing 12 unique drawings per second, but the projector still happily runs at 24.
Now, if you just think about this intuitively as a viewer, you probably assume ones are just inherently better, right? More drawings equals smoother motion, which equals higher quality.
You would naturally think that. Pure logic dictates that packing in more visual data is always better. But there's a remarkably strong counter-argument, championed by absolute masters like Ken Harris and Neil Boyle, that twos actually look significantly better from an artistic standpoint.
Why? How can less information look better?
It's called the sparkle.
The sparkle. That sounds almost magical.
It's really about visual texture. When you relentlessly animate everything smoothly on ones, the resulting movement can easily become so impossibly smooth that it starts to feel mushy. It visually slides across the screen. It completely loses its firm grip on the reality of the paper. It starts to look eerily like a flawless computer simulation or heavily processed rotoscope footage. It totally lacks physical friction.
It's almost too perfect for the human brain to accept as a drawing.
Exactly. When you drop it to twos, there is a tiny, almost subliminal visual vibration on the screen. Your eye barely registers that it is actually rapidly watching a series of static drawings. That slight staccato rhythm gives it a profound vitality. It forcefully reminds your brain that it feels more like vibrant art and less like a cold simulation of reality.
The text specifically mentions Art Babbitt constantly nagging Williams about this exact phenomenon.
Yeah, Babbitt would constantly look over his shoulder and say, "That's too realistic." One of the fundamental points of animation is that it is explicitly not like light. If you intentionally make it too flawlessly smooth, you effectively kill the charming illusion. You want a heightened caricature of movement, not a depressing simulation of it.
But obviously there have to be practical exceptions to this rule. You certainly can't just mandate using twos for absolutely everything.
No, absolutely not. The golden rule of thumb here is always use twos for normal, everyday action. Walks, talking, subtle acting. But you must switch to ones for incredibly fast action. If a frantic character zips entirely across the background in just half a second, you desperately need ones.
Why does speed dictate that change?
Because if a character is moving incredibly fast, but you are holding them on twos, the physical spatial distance between drawing A and drawing B is massively huge. Your eye totally stops seeing continuous movement and instead starts seeing 2 disparate flashing images. The image painfully strobes, it jitters across the screen. You absolutely need the extra breakdown drawings provided by ones to smoothly bridge that massive spatial gap and successfully trick the human eye.
And I assume the same logic applies to camera pans as well.
Right on the money. If your camera is smoothly panning horizontally across a painted background on ones, but your character is walking through that background on twos, they will visually vibrate and stutter violently against the smooth background. It looks exactly like a horrible technical glitch. So for any camera pans, you frequently have to bite the bullet and switch the walking character onto ones just to properly match the camera's frame rate.
But let's definitely not ignore the blunt economic reality of this whole debate.
Twos are exactly half the physical labor, and critically half the monetary cost. That is a massively powerful argument in any commercial studio environment. If a director can successfully get that artistic sparkle we talked about and simultaneously save 50% of the drawing budget, it's a no-brainer. That's exactly why twos became the gold standard for television features.
Before we wrap up this intensely technical segment, we absolutely have to touch on the pegs. The great top pegs versus bottom pegs holy war. Now, this is really just about the physical, tactile interface of drawing on a desk, but people got unbelievably heated about it.
It is basically an animation civil war. The pegs, for context, are just the little metal bars protruding from the desk that hold the punched paper firmly in place so all the drawings align perfectly when stacked. Now you can physically mount those pegs at the top of your drawing paper or down at the bottom near your stomach.
And the absolute titans of the industry totally split down the middle on this. Ken Harris loudly championed top pegs.
Yeah.
Frank Thomas fiercely defended bottom pegs. Why were they so divided?
It entirely comes down to the physical action of flipping versus rolling the paper. Ken Harris loved top pegs because you can effectively flip the stacked pages like a fast flip book. You loosely hold the stack of paper between your fingers, pull them back, and rapidly let them drop to physically see the motion happen in real time as you draw. It's all about viscerally feeling the flow and timing.
And Frank Thomas hated that.
Frank vastly preferred bottom pegs because it allows you to easily roll the drawings. You stack them up neatly and gently, roll the top sheets back toward yourself to carefully compare the fresh drawing to the completed one underneath. This method is infinitely better for meticulously checking your volumes. You can slowly roll it and see exactly if the tip of the nose on drawing B lines up mathematically with the nose on drawing A.
So it's essentially top pegs for prioritizing flow and bottom pegs for prioritizing structural accuracy.
Roughly, yes. And Ken Harris actually had this hilariously bitter conspiracy theory about the whole thing. He angrily claimed that bottom pegs were only ever invented because camera operators were fundamentally lazy.
Famous lazy cameraman theory.
He was utterly convinced that cameramen just simply didn't want to exert the effort to reach their arms all the way up under the heavy hot glass platen of the camera to carefully place the drawings on top pegs. So he thought they selfishly invented bottom pegs just to make their own lives slightly easier. He literally called them bums.
I just love the intense burning passion over where exactly some small holes are punched in a piece of paper. It really shows how deeply they cared about the micro details of their craft. But there was eventually a clever compromise to this war, right? Roy Naisbitt came up with a brilliant hack.
The taped peg bar, it's so beautifully simple. Naisbitt just took a loose metal peg bar, heavily taped it onto a thin piece of clear plastic, and he just moved it wherever he damn well needed it. He'd tape it on the side, move it to the top for flipping, stick it on the bottom for rolling, even put it on a weird diagonal angle if he was drawing a tricky perspective shot. It completely freed him from the rigid desk setup. Williams openly calls it a spectacularly great solution.
It's just classic, brilliant problem solving directly in the trenches.
And honestly, that's really what this entire dense chapter is really all about. It is decidedly not academic ivory tower theory. It is gritty trench warfare survival strategies for forcing thousands of static pencil drawings to move convincingly and not break down.
So we have successfully advanced backwards to 1940. We've completely rebuilt the structural house from the concrete up. We have our precise charts for controlling spacing. We've identified our critical keys for anchoring the storytelling. We've carefully mapped our breakdowns for smooth physical arcs. And we've meticulously filled out our X sheets for musical timing.
We finally have the complete grammar.
That is the absolute perfect way to put it. Williams is fundamentally arguing that you simply cannot write beautiful poetry, which is the organic emotional magic of a great animation performance, without deeply understanding the boring grammar first.
And that is exactly why advancing backwards is genuinely the only reliable way forward. If you lazily rely on a modern computer program to automatically calculate your in-betweening, or you totally rely on a digital software rig to rigidly hold your character's volume for you, you might certainly get something that technically moves very smoothly, but you absolutely will not get a true performance. You will never get that human sparkle.
It ultimately all comes back to control. Grim Natwick's tiny little graphite tick marks on the edge of the page gave him total mastery over time, and properly identifying the true keys gives you complete mastery over the emotional story.
And look, in a modern world where our creative tools are becoming increasingly fully automated, that deep fundamental understanding of the actual why and the underlying how is exactly what separates a mere software operator from a true artist. Literally anyone can push a button and make a digital character move across the screen right now. But not everyone knows how to make that character actually act.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought today. Something to really chew on long after this is over. We talked a lot about testing today, about how the great Ken Harris insisted on testing absolutely everything to be sure of the feeling, and how modern digital tools make testing completely instantaneous.
The undo button is a highly addictive drug.
It really, really is. But I seriously wonder, does the modern ability to just casually undo and instantly play back our work actually make us fundamentally lazier planners? Back in 1940, testing a scene was a massive logistical hassle. You had to physically shoot the film, blindly send it to a chemical lab, and anxiously wait 24 whole hours just to see if your timing worked. So you absolutely had to plan your keys perfectly in your head first. You were forced to think exactly like Frank Thomas, sweating for 8 hours over the emotion of that one single drawing of a cat.
That is the real modern danger. If Testing becomes incredibly cheap and frictionless. Rigorous planning inevitably becomes undervalued. And if you don't aggressively plan the deep structure, you are really just blindly decorating a fragile house that is destined to collapse.
So the very next time you sit down to watch any animated movie, whether it's the classic Snow White or the absolute latest hyper-rendered Pixar blockbuster, I want you to actively look for the keys. Try to consciously spot those vital storytelling drawings anchoring the scene. And more importantly, closely watch the screen and look for that magical sparkle.
Seriously, pause it, step through it, and see if you can explicitly spot where they dropped it onto tubes.
Exactly. Thank you so much for diving deep with us today. We will absolutely see you on the next one.
Keep drawing out there.